Deep in the heart of Turkey's Adana province, situated a mere 70 kilometers from the volatile Syrian border, sits an installation that defies the standard logic of Middle Eastern military presence. This is not just another forward operating base or a regional hub for drone surveillance. Incirlik Air Base is a relic of the Cold War that has remained stubbornly relevant, housing a strategic asset that no other American installation in the region possesses. It is the site of the world's most dangerous what-if. While other bases boast Patriot missile batteries, THAAD systems, or the sleek silhouettes of F-35 squadrons, Incirlik holds something far more consequential, the physical hardware of the apocalypse. Stored within hardened underground WS-3 vaults are between 50 and 60 American B-61 nuclear gravity bombs. These are the cornerstones of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, a doctrine designed to ensure that should the unthinkable occur, Allied aircraft can deliver a devastating response. For decades, these weapons have survived coups, regional upheavals, and shifting political tides between Washington and Ankara. They have been the silent X factor in every war room calculation from Moscow to Tehran. But on Wednesday, the 4th of March 2026, the silence surrounding these vaults was shattered by the roar of an incoming ballistic missile and the desperate scramble of NATO's integrated air defenses. The weapon was a variant of the Iranian Fate 110, a medium-range ballistic missile known for its reliability and precision. Its flight path was a masterclass in regional provocation. It crossed the borders of Iraq and Syria, entered the airspace of the eastern Mediterranean, and banked in a calculated arc toward the Turkish coast. For the first time since NATO's founding in 1949, the alliance's Article 5 guarantee was tested not by a theoretical exercise or a diplomatic spat, but by a kinetic strike. A NATO destroyer positioned in the Mediterranean engaged and destroyed the missile before it could breach Turkish soil. It was the first time the 3-2 nation alliance had fired a weapon in active combat to defend a member state against an Iranian attack. In the immediate aftermath, the air was thick with the fog of diplomatic face-saving. Turkish officials, speaking on the condition of anonymity, suggested the missile was a stray aimed at a base in Greek Cyprus that had simply veered off course. NATO's official condemnation was pointed but conspicuously vague regarding the intended target. However, the geometry of the trajectory tells a much darker story. A missile does not precisely navigate the borders of three sovereign nations and execute a complex maritime approach, only to accidentally find itself on a collision course with a nuclear weapons storage facility. The arc was calculated. The intent was unmistakable. If that missile had hit its mark, the world would be waking up to the single most consequential military strike against NATO infrastructure since World War II. The narrow escape at Incirlik was not just a victory for air defense. It was a chilling revelation that the red lines of the post-war international system are no longer being respected. The threshold has not just been touched, it has been targeted. To understand why the March 4th Intercept sent shockwaves through the halls of the Pentagon and NATO's headquarters in Brussels, one must look beneath the concrete of the Adana Plateau. Incirlik Air Base is a paradox of modern warfare, an aging Cold War relic that remains the most high-stakes piece of real estate in the Middle East. While the world focuses on the high-tech wizardry of Patriot batteries, THAAD interceptors, and F-35 stealth squadrons, these are merely the outer layers of a much darker core. The true gravity of Incirlik lies in its WS-3 weapon storage and security system, vaults hardened underground bunkers that house approximately 50 to 60 American B-61 nuclear gravity bombs. The B-61 is not a sophisticated long-range missile. It is a tactical nuclear weapon designed to be dropped from a fighter bomber. Its presence at Incirlik is the physical manifestation of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement. This doctrine, a cornerstone of Western security since the 1950s, dictates that American nuclear weapons are prepositioned in Allied countries, so that in the event of a total nuclear war, Allied aircraft can be equipped to deliver them. It is the hardware that transforms NATO's security guarantee from a theoretical promise into a terrifying reality. In any other context, 60 gravity bombs might seem like an oversized insurance policy. In the context of a direct confrontation with Iran, they represent a strategic weight that changes every calculation in every war room on Earth the moment they become a target. The resilience of the vaults. These weapons have been at Incirlik for decades, surviving through geopolitical shifts that would have shuttered any other installation. They are stored in high-tech subterranean vaults directly beneath the hangar floors, protected by layers of reinforced concrete and sophisticated electronic security. Their resilience is legendary among strategic planners. Most notably, they survived the 2016 Turkish coup attempt, a period of extreme instability, where the Turkish government temporarily cut power to the base and blocked American aircraft from taking off. Even as the base sat in darkness and the political relationship between Washington and Ankara frayed, the B-61S remained. They have survived every regional crisis, every diplomatic spat, and every shift in the balance of power in the Levant. However, the recent Iranian strike attempt exposes a vulnerability that the vaults were never designed to handle the erosion of strategic deterrence. Deterrence works on the assumption that the cost of attacking a target is so catastrophically high that no rational actor would attempt it. By firing a ballistic missile directly toward the facility that houses NATO's nuclear deterrent, Iran has signaled that it is no longer deterred by the nuclear shadow. To Tehran, Incirlik is no longer an untouchable sanctuary. It is a high-value target whose destruction would represent the single most consequential military strike against NATO infrastructure since the end of World War II. The psychology of nuclear prepositioning. The danger of having B-61S at Incirlik is that they create a use-it-or-lose-it dilemma. If a base housing nuclear weapons is under imminent threat of being overrun or destroyed by conventional ballistic missiles, the pressure to respond not just with conventional force, but with the very weapons stored there becomes immense. This is the operational pressure that senior fellows at institutes like RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, warn about. A deliberate Iranian strike on Incirlik is not just an attack on Turkey, it is a direct assault on the American nuclear umbrella. The presence of these bombs makes every Iranian missile launch a potential existential crisis. When the Fate 110 entered, the Eastern Mediterranean NATO commanders didn't just see a missile, they saw a threat to the global nuclear order. If the missile had penetrated the defense and struck the WS-3 vaults, even if it didn't cause a nuclear detonation, the radiological contamination and the symbolic decapitation of NATO's regional deterrent would have forced a response that would likely have triggered World War III. Deterrents in a post-war world, the B-61S at Incirlik are the ultimate symbols of the post-World War II international system. They were designed to keep the Soviet Union at bay, acting as a tripwire that ensured any invasion of a NATO ally would be met with American nuclear might. But in 2026, the tripwire is being kicked by a regional power with a decentralized command structure and an appetite for high-stakes gambling. The Iranian missile wasn't just aiming for a runway. It was aiming for the foundational guarantee of European and Middle Eastern security. By targeting the base where the unthinkable is stored, Iran has effectively crossed a threshold that every wargame and deterrence model of the last 80 years was designed to make uncrossable. The nuclear shadow at Incirlik, once a source of absolute security, has now become a lightning rod for the most dangerous escalation in modern history. The question is no longer whether the bombs are safe in their vaults, but whether the mere presence of those bombs is now the very thing drawing the fire that could consume the region. For more than 7 decades, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has functioned as the world's most formidable insurance policy, an alliance everyone paid into but no one ever truly wanted to cash. Since its founding in 1949, NATO's primary utility has been psychological. The mere existence of a 3-2 nation collective defense pact was enough to keep the peace in Europe. But on Wednesday, the 4th of March 2026, the insurance policy was cashed in the most violent way possible. When a NATO destroyer stationed in the eastern Mediterranean launched its interceptors to neutralize an Iranian ballistic missile, the alliance crossed a Rubicon it had avoided for 77 years. This was not a training exercise. It was not a deterrent deployment like those seen during the Cold War or the Syrian Civil War. This was the first time in history that NATO fired a weapon in active combat to defend a member state's territory from a direct attack by a sovereign nation. The weapon in question, a medium-range Fate 110 variant, is a centerpiece of Iran's decentralized arsenal. Unlike the primitive Scuds of the 1990s, the Fate 110 is a solid-fueled, road-mobile beast designed for rapid deployment and high accuracy. Its flight path on Wednesday was a surgical traversal of Middle Eastern geography. It launched from Iranian soil, crossed the sovereign airspace of Iraq, traversed the war-torn skies of Syria, and entered the eastern Mediterranean at a precise angle before banking toward the Turkish coast in the direction of Adana, the stray missile myth versus strategic geometry. In the hours following the intercept, Turkish officials, desperate to avoid an immediate escalatory spiral, began circulating a face-saving narrative. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, one official suggested the missile was actually aimed at a base in Greek Cyprus, but had simply veered off course. It was a classic diplomatic out, an attempt to categorize a potential act of war as a mere technical glitch. However, the geometry of the trajectory, as described by military analysts, flatly contradicts this theory. Ballistic missiles do not simply veer across 3 different countries in a precisely calculated arc and then suddenly miss by hundreds of miles. The path through Iraq and Syria into the Mediterranean was the trajectory of a weapon that knew exactly where it was going. To hit Cyprus from Iran, a missile would take a distinctly different southward path. To reach Incirlik, however, it must do exactly what this missile did, enter the Mediterranean at an angle that forces NATO interceptors to engage from the sea. A missile that was aimed at Incirlik, the base whose destruction would represent the single most consequential military strike against NATO infrastructure since World War II, would be intercepted exactly as this missile was intercepted. The logic is inescapable. NATO didn't shoot down a stray, they shot down a sniper shot aimed at the alliance's most sensitive regional asset, breaking the Article 5 seal. The operational significance of this intercept cannot be overstated. Since 1949, Article 5, the collective defense commitment stating that an attack on one is an attack on all, has been the foundational guarantee of European security. While Article 5 was famously invoked after the 9/11 attacks that was a response to a non-state terrorist group, the March 4th incident is fundamentally different. It was a state-on-state engagement. By firing its interceptors, NATO operationally fulfilled the spirit of Article 5 before the politicians in Brussels even had time to draft a press release. This creates a fascinating and dangerous strategic lag. On one hand, you have the kinetic reality NATO is in an active shooting war with Iran to protect Turkey. On the other hand, you have the diplomatic rhetoric US and NATO officials scrambled to downplay the incident, claiming there was no sense that it would trigger the formal legal mechanism of Article 5. This gap between what is happening on the radar screens and what is being said at the podiums is where the current crisis lives. For the first time, NATO has moved from being a nuclear umbrella to an active shield in a hot conflict. The alliance is no longer just standing by. It is pulling the trigger. The message from Tehran. From the perspective of Iranian military planners, the intercept was likely as much a test as it was an attack. By firing a single high-precision missile toward a target as sensitive as Incirlik, Iran forced NATO to reveal its hand. Tehran now knows the exact response time, the engagement protocols of NATO destroyers in the Mediterranean, and perhaps most importantly, the political appetite of the alliance for a wider war. They saw that while NATO will defend its members' airspace, the alliance is terrified of the A-word, Article 5. Iran has successfully identified the threshold they can fire a ballistic missile at a NATO nuclear storage site, have it intercepted, and the US Pentagon chief will still stand at a podium and say it doesn't trigger anything. This realization that NATO is operationally engaged but diplomatically paralyzed is the most dangerous outcome of the March 4th intercept. It suggests to Iran that they can continue to saturate the defense systems until something finally gets through, knowing that the West is still desperately trying to avoid calling this what it actually is, a global war. While the world's eyes were fixed on the near miss at Incirlik, the conflict's geography was simultaneously fracturing across 3 oceans and 2 hemispheres. The events of Wednesday morning prove that this is no longer a localized border dispute. It is a global maritime entanglement. From the sun-drenched coast of Cyprus to the deep silent waters off the coast of Sri Lanka, the theater of operations has expanded at a rate that has left traditional military logistics scrambling to keep pace. The siege of Cyprus, a hub under fire, in the eastern Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus has become a central node in the escalating confrontation. For 6 days, the United Kingdom's RAF Akrotiri, a sovereign base area that serves as a critical staging ground for Western operations, has been under a literal state of siege. Iranian-made drones launched from proxies, or perhaps even from vessels at sea, have struck the base 3 times in less than a week. On Sunday, a drone caused minor damage, but by Wednesday the situation had deteriorated into a full-scale regional air defense crisis. Authorities in Cyprus were forced to close the airspace above Larnaca after detecting a suspicious object grounding civilian flights and signaling that the war had finally bled into the European vacation corridor. The response has been a frantic multinational effort. Greece, invoking its deep security ties to the island, dispatched 2 pairs of F-16S and frigates to circle the waters, providing targeting coordinates for intercepts. Britain, meanwhile, deployed the HMS Dragon, a Type 45 destroyer, designed specifically for high-intensity air defense to bolster the shield around Akrotiri. The irony of the situation is not lost on observers. The British Prime Minister, who had previously stated he doesn't believe in regime change from the skies, has now authorized American operational use of these very bases. Cyprus is no longer a neutral bystander. It is a frontline state where Greek jets and British destroyers are actively hunting Iranian hardware in the Mediterranean sun. The Indian Ocean, the silence of the deep. While the drone war raged over Cyprus, a far more lethal and historic engagement was unfolding thousands of miles away in the Indian Ocean. In the early hours of Wednesday, a United States submarine achieved a milestone that had not been recorded in over 80 years. For the first time since the closing months of World War II, an American submarine conducted a confirmed torpedo kill on an enemy combatant ship. The target was the Iris Dana, a Mujtaba-class frigate and the crown jewel of Iran's regular navy. As the most modern surface combatant in Tehran's fleet, its presence near Sri Lanka was a projection of Iranian blue water ambition. That ambition ended abruptly on the ocean floor. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the sinking at the Pentagon, describing it as a decisive and devastating blow. The human cost was staggering. While the Sri Lankan Navy managed to rescue 32 survivors following a distress call, at least 80 Iranian sailors are feared dead, their remains distributed across the currents of the Indian Ocean. This was not a soft engagement or a warning shot. It was a cold, calculated exercise in undersea supremacy. By using a torpedo, a weapon of total destruction rather than a harpoon missile or a drone strike, the U.S. Navy sent a message of absolute lethality. A map without borders. The sheer scale of the Wednesday engagements is breathtaking. The source document today identifies a map that now covers 11 countries, including Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Lebanon, and Turkey. 3 oceans and 5 seas: the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Geopolitics of the Global South, reaching as far as the coast of Sri Lanka. This is the NATO dimension of the war's geography. When a U.S. submarine sinks an Iranian frigate in the Indian Ocean at the same moment NATO interceptors are firing over Turkish airspace, the threshold of regional escalation has been obliterated. We are witnessing the restructuring of the global order in real time. The maritime escalation serves a dual purpose for Tehran. By forcing the U.S. and its allies to defend assets from Cyprus to Sri Lanka, Iran is thinning the line. They are testing the limits of Western naval endurance. Every Greek frigate diverted to Cyprus and every U.S. submarine committed to the Indian Ocean is one less asset available to guard the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean. As the Iris Dana rests on the ocean floor and the smoke clears over Larnaca, the question for NATO and the Pentagon is no longer if the war will spread but where the next front will open. The geography of consequence has crossed the threshold that every war game was designed to make uncrossable. The North Atlantic Treaty's Article 5 is the most famous sentence in the history of modern diplomacy. An armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all. It is intended to be a binary switch, on or off, peace or total war. But on Wednesday, as an Iranian missile was vaporized by NATO interceptors over the Mediterranean, the world discovered that this switch is no longer binary. It has been replaced by a dimmer switch of strategic ambiguity operated by leaders who are terrified of what happens when the lights go fully up. The Pentagon's rhetorical shield. Standing at the podium in the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth provided a masterclass in downplaying a historic event. Despite the fact that NATO had just conducted its first ever combat intercept to protect a member state from a sovereign nation's ballistic missile, Hegseth insisted there was no sense that the incident would trigger Article Woo. This is the same Pentagon chief who previously characterized the facility where 6 Americans died as fortified and insisted that the U.S. is winning decisively and devastatingly. Hegseth's dismissal of Article 5 isn't just a matter of semantics, it is a calculated effort to avoid a legal trap, invoking the collective defense clause against Iran while the U.S. is already in a kinetic struggle, with Tehran would force all 32 NATO members to formally become parties to the conflict. This would require every European capital from Lisbon to Tallinn to answer a question they have spent the last decade avoiding. Whose war is this? The European energy factor. The hesitation in Brussels and Washington is deeply tied to a cold, economic reality. With European gas prices sitting at an 85% premium, the continent is staring down an energy abyss. Russia, the silent observer in this escalating drama, is counting the days until European gas storage facilities run dry. Moscow understands that the more NATO is dragged into a hot war in the Middle East, the more leverage Russia gains over the back-channel conversations in Berlin, Paris, and Rome. For many European members, Article 5 is a shield they want to hide behind, not a sword they want to draw. If NATO acknowledges that the strike on Turkey was a deliberate attack on the alliance's nuclear infrastructure, the legal machinery of collective defense becomes nearly impossible to halt. By pretending the missile was a stray or a technicality, the alliance buys itself time, but at the cost of its own credibility. Turkey's unilateral pivot, perhaps the most telling reaction, came from Ankara itself. Fahrettin Altun, Turkey's communications chief, issued a warning that was notably devoid of NATO-centric language. He did not call on the alliance. He did not mention Article 5. Instead, he stated that Turkey would take all necessary steps within the framework of international law. This framing is a deliberate strategic separation. By choosing the language of international law over the language of the NATO treaty, Turkey is reserving the right to act unilaterally. If Iran fires again, Ankara wants the freedom to retaliate with its own massive military, one of the largest in the alliance, without being bogged down by the consensus-driven bureaucracy of 31 other nations who may not be prepared to fight. Turkey is effectively saying, we will defend ourselves and we will do it on our terms, not NATO's. The ambiguity of standing firmly. The official response from NATO spokesperson Alison Hart summarized the alliance's current paralysis. NATO stands firmly with all allies, including Turkey, as Iran continues its indiscriminate attacks across the region. Standing firmly is the language of a group that has been provoked but remains undecided. It is a diplomatic placeholder. As military planners at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, point out, the distinction between a missile that is stopped and a missile that hits is the difference between a diplomatic protest and a regional conflagration. By refusing to invoke Article 5, NATO has told Iran exactly where the threshold lies. A single intercepted missile is unacceptable but legally ignorable. A salvo that hits a target is a war. Tehran now knows that the A word is the one thing the West is most afraid to say, and in the world of high-stakes brinkmanship, fear is the ultimate vulnerability. The strategic landscape of Day 6 is not merely defined by the flight of missiles or the sinking of frigates. Its most profound transformation is occurring within the opaque halls of power in Tehran. As NATO destroyers and American submarines play a deadly game of kinetic chess across the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, the political structure of the Islamic Republic has undergone a paradigm shift that renders every Western, post-Khamenei stabilization model obsolete. The news confirmed by independent outlets like Iran International is the ultimate geopolitical wildcard, the assembly of experts acting under immense pressure from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. IRGC has elected Mojtaba Khamenei as the next supreme leader, the invisible successor. For years, Western intelligence agencies and Beltway think tanks have obsessively curated targeting lists and influence charts to predict who would fill the vacuum left by the aging Ali Khamenei. The names of moderate reformers, technocratic pragmatists, and established clerics were shuffled and reshuffled. Yet, as the smoke clears from the latest round of American strikes, it has become chillingly apparent that the most important candidate was the one they missed. At 55 years old, Mojtaba Khamenei is not a moderate, nor is he a technocrat interested in re-entering the JCPOA or seeking a grand bargain with Washington. He is his father's closest ideological heir, a man forged within the IRGC's intelligence apparatus. This is a critical distinction. Unlike the clerical elite of the previous generation, Mojtaba represents the total merger of the Iranian state with its most radical military arm. He has spent his entire adult life in the shadows of the security services, the very same apparatus currently executing a pre-authorized operational plan against American assets across 11 countries. The IRGC's kingmaker moment. The rise of Mojtaba is the IRGC's ultimate victory. By securing his succession, the Revolutionary Guards have ensured that the Iranian military will no longer be a tool of the state. It is the state. This is why the recent American claims of success, including the Pentagon's assertion that their strikes knocked out all the candidates on the list, ring so hollow. Mojtaba survived because he was never visible enough to be targeted. He was the architect in the basement while the Western world was looking at the figures on the balcony. Under his leadership, Iran's strategy has transitioned from regional proxy warfare to a high-stakes direct confrontation. The decentralized command structure that has so frustrated American military planners is not a sign of chaos, but a deliberate design. It is Mojtaba's signature, a system where every Iranian cell from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean knows its objective without needing a direct line back to Tehran. This is the intelligence background at work creating a war machine that is as difficult to decapitate as it is to deter. The death of diplomacy. For the Biden and Trump administrations alike, the hope for a stable Iran always rested on the idea of a technocratic successor, someone like a young Rafsanjani who might prioritize economic survival over ideological expansion. Mojtaba's election kills that hope. To him, the 85% premium on European gas and the desperation of NATO members are not problems to be solved, but leverage to be exploited. Mojtaba Khamenei is the hardware that makes the Iranian threat permanent. He is the operator who understands that a single ballistic missile intercepted at Incirlik is just as valuable as one that hits because it exposes the cracks in the NATO alliance. While Secretary Hegseth tells reporters that America is winning without mercy, Mojtaba is watching the clock. He knows that as long as the IRGC controls the succession and the energy markets, time is on Tehran's side. He is not fighting a war of attrition. He is fighting a war of restructuring. Every missile fired at a NATO base and every ship sunk in the Indian Ocean serves to prove his thesis that the American-led international system is a paper tiger that will fold as soon as its European allies begin to freeze. The new Iranian era. The succession dimension completes the strategic landscape of Day 6. America is no longer facing a dying regime led by an octogenarian cleric. It is facing a revitalized IRGC-led military state, headed by a man who knows exactly how the Western intelligence community thinks. The Kurdish proxy plan, confirmed by Reuters, the same strategy that failed so spectacularly in 1991, is a desperate attempt by Washington to use 20th century tactics against a 21st century intelligence. Operative. As Mojtaba Khamenei takes his place in the succession queue, the physical embodiment of the IRGC's will, the conflict enters a new, more dangerous phase. The question is no longer who will lead Iran, but whether the West has the stomach to fight the man they didn't see coming. The missiles over Turkey and the torpedoes in the Indian Ocean are merely the opening salvos of the Mojtaba era, an era where the uncrossable thresholds of the post-war world are being crossed daily with devastating precision. The events of early March 2026 represent more than just a week of intense kinetic escalation. They mark the definitive end of the post-Cold War security architecture. For decades, the international system was built upon uncrossable thresholds, invisible lines that every war game, every deterrence model, and every alliance commitment was designed to protect. Those lines included the sanctity of NATO territory, the untouchable status of nuclear storage facilities, and the avoidance of direct state-on-state combat between major powers. In a single 2-4-hour window, every one of those thresholds was crossed. The Incirlik dimension is perhaps the most chilling. By targeting a base housing the very hardware of NATO's nuclear deterrent, Iran has demonstrated that the psychological shield of the 20th century has been shattered. The narrow escape in Adana was not just a victory for NATO's air defense, it was a revelation that the alliance's foundational guarantee, Article 5, is currently being treated as a negotiable legal hurdle, rather than an absolute retaliatory trigger. When the Pentagon chief claims there is no sense of collective defense, while a NATO member's nuclear infrastructure is under fire, the message to adversaries is clear: the umbrella is leaking. Simultaneously, the sinking of the Iris Dana in the Indian Ocean signals a return to a total war footing not seen since 1945. The first American submarine torpedo kill in over 80 years is not a tactical adjustment. It is an operational declaration that international waters are no longer a sanctuary. By choosing the absolute lethality of a torpedo over the measured response of a missile strike, the United States has signaled that it is no longer interested in managing the conflict, but in winning it without mercy. Yet, as the physical war rages from the Mediterranean to Sri Lanka, a second, more patient war is being won in the shadows. Russia, watching the collapse of European energy security and the 85% surge in gas prices, understands that time is a weapon. Moscow is counting on the reality that while NATO may fire interceptors today, its member states cannot survive a winter of empty storage tanks and back-channel compromises. With Mojtaba Khamenei now at the helm in Tehran, a leader forged in the intelligence shadows and backed by the unwavering hand of the IRGC, the prospect of a diplomatic off-ramp has vanished. The world is no longer dealing with a regional crisis. It is witnessing the restructuring of the entire global order. The threshold has not just been crossed, it has been obliterated. As we move into Day 7, the question is no longer whether we can return to the status quo, but who will be left to write the history of the new world that is currently being born in fire and salt.